The Elder Scrolls is a universe full of myth, legend, and fact, but the hard part is discerning which is which, a task which at times is impossible, especially when you consider the magical, metaphysical elements of the Orbis. Nirn is a place where things can be both fact and myth when you consider the time-breaking occurrences of dragon breaks and the machinations of gods and beings far beyond mortal comprehension. A character that I think personifies the nature of the Elder Scrolls universe more than anyone else is Vivec, the warrior poet of the Tribunal, the most controversial, paradoxical, and enigmatic character that walked Tamriel. Welcome to Fudge Muppet, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Scott, and today I'm going to do my best to explain the full story of Vivec. Beyond any doubt, the ascension of the Divine Tribunal led Azuras Curse into a golden age. Despite new ashen skin and eyes of violent red, the Dunmer took pride in their new god kings, their physical changes only proof of the old gods' cruelty. Almalexia, Sothasil, and Vivec, collectively known as Almsavie, were considered greater than their anticipations, the good Daedra, Boethia, Azura, and Mephala. While the ancient Daedra were necessary, they were callous, disassociated from the affairs of mortals, whereas now the elves of Morrowind had gods intimately aware of mortal nature as well as the trials and tribulations that come with it. It was the most intimate relationship between god and mortal that ever existed. To be able to kneel before a god and converse with them as you would your father, to be able to witness the tangible miracles that are performed before you, to be able to see the caring intent of your divine leaders. It is no wonder that the Dunmer have been known as the most zealous of people. Heresy is unthinkable, and even when thoughts of it arise, a society-wide subconscious denial occurs. It's not like the Dunmer are unaware of the controversies and conflicting accounts surrounding the nature of the Tribunal's apotheosis, as is said in the book Vivec and Mephala. It is important to remember that Vivec is also known to the Dunmer as the transcendent evolution of the Daedra that anticipated him, Black Hands Mephala, a foundation figure for the earliest Chimer. This darker side of Vivec does not appear in the popular literature and liturgy, but is instinctively understood and accepted by the Dunmer as an integral part of Vivec's divine aspect. As you will continue to see as we move further in this full story, Vivec, more than Sothasil or Almalexia, personifies this duality of natures, so much so that it is his central theme. His very skin is half Chimer, half Dunmer, the personification of past and present. He is known to be a hermaphrodite, possessing the genitalia of both male and female. Even his very earthly existence serves as some kind of intermediary between god and mortal, for in some ways he is both. It is Sothasil who describes the nature of Vivec best.
Vivec craves radical freedom, the death of all limits and restrictions. He wishes to be all things at all times. Every race, every gender, every hero, both divine and finite. But in the end, he can only be Vivec.
As complex as a character like Vivec is, we must start somewhere when delving into the full story, and why not from the beginning? Well, at least from what we can tell. Vivec's early mortal life is defined by supposition and metaphor, most of which comes from the 36 lessons of Vivec, which themselves are mythological and cryptic and serve a hidden purpose, but I'll try and tell the essence of the early life events without getting too much into the crazy. Vivec was born in the ash-bitten lands of Morrowind, a place that at the time went by a different name, Resdayn. This time was before the conquests of Vraga the Gifted, before the Nordic occupation, so we know his birth predated the 240th year of the First Era, at least according to the lessons. He was the son of a Netchman's wife, a Netchman being a herder of Netches. The legend has it that the divine form of Almalexia came to the Netchman's wife and threw her into the ocean water, where dregs took her to their castles of glass and coral. The dregs gifted her with gills and, I quote, milk milk fingers, which, just for future reference, is a thinly disguised phrase that refers to what sits in a male's underpants. This was done so that the Netchman's wife could conceive Vivec by herself. The divine form of Sotha also came to the Netchman's wife saying, "I am the clockwork king of the 3-in-1. In you is an egg of my brother-sister, who possesses invisible knowledge of words and swords, which you shall nurture until the Hortator comes." So I do realize we are mere minutes into the full story of Vivec, and it's already starting to get confusing, but let me help you break it down. Firstly, this can all be, and likely is, total mythological fabrication, and when you consider that the tribunal have not even become gods yet, it kinda doesn't make sense that Almalexia and Sotha are here at the birth of Vivec. Well, that is why I specified their divine form. You see, because of Kim, because of dragon breaks, and other metaphysical insanity, we end up with many paradoxical but apparently equally true events. For example, without getting into the other rabbit hole that is Tiber Septim, the conventional understanding is that he became Talos the God and retroactively turned Cyrodiil from an endless jungle to fertile forests and grasslands, changing the very past. So the land always was fertile grasslands and forests. So the same version of the timeline that originally birthed Talos is no longer the same timeline he presides over. In a similar way, the idea in this sermon is that the god forms of Sotha and Almalexia retroactively go back in time and orchestrate the birth of a divine Vivec. That would make a timeline where Vivec has always been divine. Now, you can choose to disregard that and treat the lessons of Vivec as just mythological stories made to emphasize his grandeur, but it's an interesting concept regardless. The preceding sermons continue to tell of Vivec's divine birth and early life of legend, but today I wish to tell the essence of these events, the more likely story, at least from a skeptic's perspective. It's probable that the mortal Vivec was just the son of a poor Netchman and his wife. Vivec eventually meets Nerevar as a caravan guard and joins him, later presumably as they grew close and time went on, and as Nerevar gained renown and married Almalexia, Vivec became a junior counselor to Nerevar. Vivec was his most cherished among Nerevar's council, along with his other favourite counsellor, Sotha. Now that's what we can piece together that's a plausible telling of events. But before we move on, I'd like to bring up Michael Kirkbride's piece that he wrote in 2012 called What My Beloved Taught Me. Now, while Kirkbride was no longer working for Bethesda at this point, and this piece isn't strictly canon, Kirkbride did write much of the lore surrounding the tribunal, and he wrote the 36 lessons of Vivec. What I'm saying is, he knows the characters very well, he had large parts in creating them, so I'm willing to take this piece with a little more credence. And I also think it's a neat little backstory for Vivec, and it doesn't undermine existing canon lore either. Regardless, keep in mind that this origin is not strictly canon. So What My Beloved Taught Me is essentially an interview between Nerevar and Vivec. I'll give you the details. This story places Vivec growing up in the city of Mournhold during the Nordic occupation. He is a hermaphrodite born to a Netchman, but was later orphaned. At this time, he went by a different name, one unbeknownst to us. As a teenager, he was a thug in a gang of gutter snipes that were willing to do anything for money, whether that be killing, stealing, or prostitution. Surviving was a full-time job and done by any means necessary. One day, a caravan was passing through, and the caravan guard was Nerevar, who stopped to speak to the boy. Nerevar saw something special in him. At first, the boy tried to sell carnal pleasures, but became hostile when he realized Nerevar was not interested. After a philosophical joust, Vivec grew to like Nerevar and saw that he had great ambitions, chief among them seeking a Resdain free from Nordic occupation. He looked to Nerevar's sigil and saw the V. He decided to wear this V twice, making his new name Vivec. To clarify, V as in the phonetic sound, and then Vec is the name of the letter in the Daedric alphabet, hence Vivec. That is the end of the origin story What My Beloved Taught Me, and now we head back to the canon lore. But I think that origin story just gives so much more character to their relationship and Vivec's humble yet gritty origins. Nerevar would become the Hortator and general for Indoral Almalexia, whom he will later marry, becoming Indoral Nerevar. Now, if that's confusing, at least in this time, the Kai'ma put family clan names first. Indoral Nerevar led the Kai'ma people in alliance with Dumak Dwarf King and the Dwemer against the Nordic occupants of Resdayn. Together they were successful and formed a great friendship. Kai'ma and Dwemer were at peace. However, Vivec, Almalexia, and Sotha Sil doubted that such a peace would last, and ultimately they would be proven right. Upon discovery of the Dwemer's profane attempts to create themselves a new god called the Numidium, war was on the horizon. Then Nerevar went back to Vvardenfell one last time, hoping that negotiations and compromise might once again preserve the peace. But this time the friends Nerevar and Dumak quarrelled bitterly, and as a result, the Kai'ma and Dwemer went to war. And so begins the War of the First Council, which lasted for years but finally culminates in the Battle of Red Mountain, one of the most pivotal moments in Elder Scrolls history. It's here that the Red Moment occurs, a dragon break where we end up with different simultaneous, contradictory but true series of events. If you need more elaboration on dragon breaks, you can check out the link in the description below. Though there is some debate regarding whether or not this was a dragon break, believing that it is just a situation where there are conflicting accounts of the same moment. But the main evidence for the dragon break is the supposed activation of the Numidium by the Dwemer, their mysterious disappearance, and also some of the simultaneous truths that Vivec is aware of, which we will discuss later on. The battle involves Nords, Orcs, Dwemer, and Kai'ma, even a Sench Khajiit called Drozira, but the ultimate result is the Dwemer disappearance and the apotheosis of the tribunal, Almalexia, Sotha Sil, and Vivec. So to really understand what happened at Red Mountain, we need to dive further into Vivec's godly character, as well as the duality that comes with him, part and parcel. Vivec is the most public, for he is the beloved warrior poet of the true people, paradoxically beautiful and bloody. Vivec is an artistic violence. This becomes all the clearer when you understand Mephala, Vivec's anticipation. Another way of thinking about the anticipations is that they are considered primal forms, cruel and callous like the harsh realities of nature and life, but the tribunal arose to take these same elements and evolve them, becoming gods of a golden age. In ways you could look at the gods of the tribunal as civilization gods, tender, caring, and protecting, but also egotistical and proud. The Dunmer people are aware of both the darker primal themes of the anticipations within the tribunal and the benevolent faces they present. In the same way, on some subconscious level, we are aware that nature is harsh and cruel, and that humans are capable of terrible violence, but it's something we don't consciously think about because we're not exposed to it. Instead, we are protected by technology and civilization. But just because we don't think about it doesn't mean it's not true or recognized. It's a similar thing with how the Dunmer view the tribunal. They are aware of the primal darker natures, but they are not publicly spoken of. From the book Vivec and Mephala. As known in the West, Mephala is the demon of murder, sex, and secrets. All of these themes contain subtle aspects and violent ones: assassination, genocide, courtship, orgy, tact, poetic truths. Mephala is understood paradoxically to contain and integrate these contradictory themes. And all of these subtle undercurrents and contradictions are present in the Dunmer concepts of Vivec, even if they are not explicitly described and explained in temple doctrine. As the story unravels, you will see more of his shadow, but let's touch on the benevolence of Vivec that comes with the unbridled ego. Your experience of Vivec in the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind would likely make this apparent. Morrowind's entire society is based around their theology and the temple. Politics, temple, statecraft, military, they are all fundamentally intertwined for the Dunmer. The houses, like House Indoril, that are inseparable, near indistinguishable from the temple, have the greatest political power. The finest of warriors are almost always a part of some religious order, such as the Temple Ordinators, who police heresy with golden visage of Nerevar, or the buoyant Armigers, great knight-like warriors solely devoted to Vivec himself, attempting to emulate him in the most noble of ways. This worship and reverence of Vivec is even understandable outside of the temple's theological doctrines. He has done a great many things for the Dunmer people. For starters, the tribunal's divine protection ushered in a golden age of thousands of years, when Morrowind was strong and mostly unaffected by outside forces or influences. They gave the people the full realization of Veloth's promised land. He fought armies of Akaviri, he fought demons, he even had a battle with Mehrunes Dagon, as told in the Pilgrim's Path. In a battle with Mehrunes Dagon, Vivec gave his own silver longsword to the Daedra Lord, rather than dishonor himself by fighting an unarmed foe. This so impressed the Dremora, the most honorable and chivalrous of Mehrunes Dagon's Daedric servants, that they now share a bond of respect and courtesy with the followers of the tribunal, though we must never forget that they are our enemies. It's a clear example of the chivalry and honor that Vivec possessed. Also of note is his infamous battle with the Ruddy Man. A child had found an ancient dead carapace of memory from the times where Molag Bal was chief of the Dregs. When this child wore the carapace, he was corrupted and transformed into the Ruddy Man. When Vivec found him near the boy's village and on Nissus, there was a violent clash of arms and an upheaval of earth. Their battle created the West Gash. Wanderers that still go there hear still the sounds of it: swords across the crust, the grunt of God, the snapping of his monster child's splintered legs. Some may wonder if many of these feats are fabricated, but there are clearly some that are as tangible as Vivec himself. It is said that the mad god Sheogorath flung a giant celestial rock called Bardau at the very city of Vivec, named for the god who inhabits it. There are other tales and other explanations for its existence, but all the same, Vivec used his godly powers to halt the rock in its tracks before it could destroy the city. Such power is incredible, but it pales in comparison to Vivec's vanity. In the 36 lessons, when questioned about the removal of the rock, Vivec says, "I would have done it myself, so if I wanted, silly Hortator. I shall keep it there with its last intention intact, so that if the love of the people of this city for me ever disappear, so shall the power that holds back their destruction." What at first seems to be an act of sparing death reveals itself to be a coercion of sorts, a threat. For if faith in Vivec shall fade along with his power, then the rock shall fall and destroy the city. And as we know in the Fourth Era, it eventually does, and triggers the eruption of Red Mountain. Symbolically, the celestial rock is made into a facility called the Ministry of Truth, where dissident priests would be imprisoned and reformed, directed by the Grand Inquisitor. The zealous theocracy, despite this, seems to suffer some sort of Stockholm Syndrome, as you can hear now. Now you may ask, what wisdom was there in this? Why did not the great Vivec simply set this celestial rock softly down upon Nirn's verdant earth? But listen well, for there is a reason, as with all things the three do. Every day our faith is tested by Bardau, and every day we show our love for Vivec and the tribunal by keeping it aloft, because it is our love, our devotion, our faith in the tribunal that keeps it hovering above. It is proof of not only Vivec's might, but of the love of his followers. The ego plays an important role in the character of Vivec, and at first you may think it one-layered and completely derived from a self-important tyrant, which is completely true, but there is another side to this, as there always is with Vivec. The tribunal, without a doubt, protect and provide a prosperous Morrowind for the Dunmer. Though without their worship and unyielding love, the very same power that enables them to do this would fade, as it is dependent on the faith and worship of the people. By coercing such love with a rigid theological hierarchy and threat of actual destruction, in turn, funnily enough, Morrowind is made a better place because the Golden Age can persevere and the gods have the powers to protect and provide. I'm by no means pretending this is not the logic of an utter sociopath, but this method does provide the results the people desire. As shown in Sermon 4, Vivec was always continuing to advance his legitimacy as a god. Here is his rebuttal when his godly machinations are touted as mere coincidence. Vivec knew that to retain his divinity that he must make a strong argument against luck. He said, "Is not the sudden revelation of corresponding conditions and disparate elements that gel at the moment of the coincidence one of the prerequisites to being in fact coincidental? Synchronicity comes out of repeated coincidences at the lowest level. Further examination shows it is the utter power of the sheer number of coincidences that leads one to the idea that synchronicity is guided by something more than chance. Therefore, synchronicity ends up invalidating the concept of the coincidental, even though they are the symptomatic signs that bring it to the surface. Thus was coincidence destroyed in the land of the Velothi. Poetry and philosophical debates are definitely the calling cards of Vivec. After all, he is renowned for his battle prowess, both with sword and tongue. He made the case that a coincidence on its own may appear as just that, a coincidence, though he asserts that the sheer number of coincidences points to a guiding hand, a god, rather him. In this debate, he forever eliminated the idea of mere coincidence. All was moved by greater powers, either those against you, such as the four corners of the House of Troubles, or those such as the tribunal, those who make life great for you. Interestingly, it is actually this protection and provision by the tribunal that runs antithetical to Vivec's philosophy and understanding of the universe. From Sermon 6 of the 36 lessons. I am Vec, your protector and the protector of Red Mountain until the end of days, which are numbered 3,333. Below me is the Savage, which we needed to remove ourselves from the Ultima. Above me is a Challenge, which bathes itself in fire and the essence of a god. The Savage below is referring to the good Daedra, the anticipations that were needed to separate from the High Elves in the time of Veloth, necessary but barbaric and cruel. The Challenge above relates to the Psijic Endeavour, which is the core philosophy of the Dunmer people. They see Lorkhan's orchestration of Mundus not as a prison like the Ultima do, but as a test to overcome, so that they can be cut into better shapes. Vivec himself has achieved at least some form of transcendence through achieving divinity, and he witnessed the true nature of the universe, achieving Kim. This is the knowledge that all is part of the one Godhead, but one must be able to accept this and at the same time be able to retain one's individuality. I'll put up a nice diagram I found that quite nicely displays such a complex idea. So have a look at that. But clearly, to be able to achieve Kim, one needs to be able to handle cognitive contradictions and paradoxes, the strange duality where two opposite things are both true. Methods of such transcendence have been taught by Vivec, elaborations on the Psijic Endeavour, what he calls the walking ways, and you may have heard Vivec being quoted, "reach heaven by violence." Yet despite all this guidance, it is still a near impossible feat. I guess it's the difference between knowing the theoretical, that all is one, compared to actually experiencing it and actually feeling it. There are further ideas about all of this, such as the final goal of Amaranth, and the further you go down this rabbit hole, the more likely we are to step outside the bounds of canon. But the essential takeaway here, in regards to Vivec's character, is that he made a mistake, which he comes to realize as his life as a god goes on. You see, by himself achieving transcendence along with the other members of the tribunal, and by protecting and providing for the Dunmer people, then he has deprived them of the very same journey. When you have living god kings guiding and protecting you, you are unlikely to run into any grave challenges that may, as they say, cut you into better shapes, meaning you are deprived of the opportunity to grow and evolve from the hardships that have been erased with the golden age of living gods. Vivec would come to realize this, and this would be one of the main reasons for writing the cryptic 36 lessons. To the layman reader, they are mere mythological stories about the birth of a god king, his deeds, and the justification for his worship. But to the keen reader, you will be able to see the contradictory hidden messages within. Sermon 36 of the lessons tells of the final showdown with the Dwemer, with the powerful Vivec. But if you look closely at the first letter of every paragraph, it spells foul murder. Now, if you're familiar with the various tales of the Battle of Red Mountain, then you would know that the Ashlander oral tradition says that Nerevar was murdered by the tribunal after the defeat of the Dwemer. The book Nerevar at Red Mountain tells it best, so allow me to read the best bits. Back in Red Mountain, Nerevar told Dagoth to protect the tools and the heart chamber until he returned. Dagoth said, But shouldn't we destroy these tools at once, so that they might never be used for evil again? But Nerevar was confused by his wounds and his sorrow, for he still loved Dumac and the Dwemer people, and so went to the fields outside of Red Mountain to confer with his queen and his generals, who had foreseen that this war would come, and whose counsel he would not ignore again. I will ask the tribunal what we shall do with them, for they have had wisdom in the past that I had not. Stay here, loyal Dagoth, until I return. Then Nerevar told his queen and generals all that had transpired under Red Mountain, and how the Dwemer had used special tools to turn their people into immortals, and of the wondrous power of the Heart of Lorkhan. The tribunal decided that the Kaimer should learn how to use this power so that Nerevar might claim Resdayn and the world for their people. Nerevar did not expect or want this, so he asked his queen and generals to help him summon Azura yet again for her guidance. But the tribunal had become as greedy as Kagrenac upon hearing of the power of the heart, and they coveted it. They made ritual as if to summon Azura as Nerevar wanted, but Almalexia used poisoned candles, and Sothasil used poisoned robes, and Vivec used poisoned invocations. Nerevar was murdered. Then Azura came forth anyway and cursed the tribunal for their foul deeds. She told them that she would use her powers over dusk and dawn to make sure Nerevar would come back and make things right again. But the tribunal laughed at her and said that they soon would be gods themselves, and that the Kaimer people would forget their old ways of worship. And Azura knew this would be true, and that it would take a long time before her power might bring Nerevar back. What you have done here today is foul beyond measure, and you will grow to regret it, for the lives of gods are not what mortals think, and matters that weigh only years to mortals weigh on gods forever. And so that they might know forever their wicked deeds, Azura changed the Kaimer into Dunmer, and their skin turned ashen and their eyes into fire. Let this mark remind you of your true selves, who, like ghouls, fed on nobility, heroism, and trust of their king. And then the tribunal went into Red Mountain and met with Dagoth. Dagoth saw what had been done, for his skin had changed as well, and he tried to avenge the death of Nerevar, but to no avail. He was driven off and thought dead. The tribunal found the tools he had been guarding, and through study of Kagrenac's methods, turned themselves into gods. Thousands of years after their apotheosis, the tribunal are still the gods of Morrowind, and the old ways of worship are remembered only by a few. And the murder of Nerevar is known to fewer, but his queen and generals still fear his return, for the words of Azura linger long, and they see the mark of her curse on their people every day. It's a great story, and it's important to note that Vivec himself denies the murder of Nerevar, at least when speaking to the Nerevarine. We did not murder Nerevar. The legend that we murdered Nerevar comes from a story told by a shield companion to Nerevar, Alandro Sul, who lived among the Ashlanders. The Ashlanders have retained Alandro Sul's account as part of their oral histories. The account is persuasive in some details, implausible in others, and is in any case false. He does, however, confess to breaking an oath to Nerevar and using the tools to become a god, an act for which he also shows remorse, but symbolically similar to how there are darker undercurrents to Vivec's divine dual nature, there is a darker truth beneath the benevolent face he puts on. It seems that Vivec would never consciously admit to such a murderous deed. Perhaps it is because it did not happen, but as we investigate the 36 lessons more, then it would seem that he has a penchant for confessions hidden in his public works, so that perhaps he in a way tells the truth, but only available to those the secret was intended for. More on that soon. If we look at Sermon 29, the scripture of the numbers, we see a list. What you do is associate each of the 35 listed numbers with a word in its respective sermon. So for example, if you go look at number 6, the walking ways, it says 266. So because this is the number 6, we go to sermon 6 and look for the 266th word, which is God. This forms part of the secret message which, when complete with all 35 words, says, "He was not born a god. His destiny did not lead him to this crime. He chose this path of his own free will. He stole the godhood and murdered the Hortator. Vivec wrote this. In the very same texts that profess a divine birth and benevolence, there lie secret messages that directly confess to the act of murdering Nerevar and stealing godhood rather than being born a prophetic figure. It also takes a jab at Destiny, claiming that he was not a victim of divine circumstance determined or preordained, but rather he made a raw choice, a product of his free will. This is thematically in tune with the nature of Vivec. While he presents as a wholly benevolent god in person, as he does in his scriptures, he also possesses a darker secret half, a duality that he can only speak of in secret messages, a subconscious confession in order to satisfy his mind. Now, as you heard, Azuras set forth a prophecy of Nerevar's return, something the tribunal fear. The Nerevarine, of which there have been many failed incarnations. But at some point, something changed within Vivec. The 36 lessons are believed to be for the Nerevarine. The secret messages are for him. Vivec realizes that stealing divinity was a mistake, and it robbed the Dunmer people of the journey to transcendence. He has watched over the millennia as his children withered in the comfort and decadence of a God-given abundance. He had denied them growth, and when he realizes this, and as Dagoth grows in power, he knows what must be done. It is why that Vivec ultimately helps the Nerevarine fulfill the prophecy and untether Dagoth from the heart of Lorkhan, but consequently ending the age of the tribunal forever. The 36 lessons are both a boastful story of all greatness he has done as a god, but also an apology of sorts, a confession to the Nerevarine, an admittance of guilt. So then you must be thinking, case closed, the tribunal murdered Nerevar, the Ashlanders had it all right, he even confessed through code. Well, not so fast. Earlier in the video, we talked about the Red Moment and Dragon Breaks, how multiple versions of events, how multiple truths can all exist paradoxically. Well, this all may apply here. As a brief tangent, I think Vivec's musings on what it is like to be a god may provide a bit of clarity. When he is asked, he says this: "It is like being a juggler. Things are always moving, and you learn to know where they are without even thinking about it. Only there are many, many things moving, and sometimes, like any juggler, you drop something. I'm afraid it has become a lot more a matter of dropping things lately. There's too much to do and not enough time, and I'm losing my touch. Perhaps I'm growing old. It is a bit like being at once awake and asleep. Awake, I am here with you, thinking and talking. Asleep, I am very, very busy. Perhaps for the other gods, the completely immortal ones, it is only like that being asleep, out of time. Me, I exist at once inside of time and outside of it. It's nice never being dead, too. When I die in the world of time, then I'm completely asleep. I'm very much aware that all I have to do is choose to wake, and I'm alive again. Many times I have deliberately tried to wait patiently, a very long time, before choosing to wake up, and no matter how long it feels like I wait, it always appears when I wake up that no time has passed at all. This is the God place, the place out of time, where everything is always happening all at once." There are two key insights to pull away from this. First, Vivec describes being a god, at least a living earthly god, as being both awake and asleep at the same time, and he suggests that the other gods, such as the Aedra and Daedra, are only asleep. He also refers to the god place, the asleep place, where everything is always happening all at once. It's a place with no time, as he says, out of time. His experience is that he can enter the God place for eons and then return to the waking world, the mortal world we experience, and no time has passed at all. So what this tells us is that Vivec, and also likely Almalexia and Sotha Sil, are caught in this weird in-between state that the other gods do not experience. From an Aedra or Daedra's point of view, it seems they experience the asleep, everything happening at once. As Azuras said, "The lives of gods are not what mortals think, and matters that weigh only years to mortals weigh on gods forever," which also suggests a different experience of time for the gods. What can be inferred from all of this is quite simply that for the gods, time is not a linear experience. Therefore, B does not have to follow A. In fact, B can come before A, or C before either. Vivec and the rest of the tribunal have to experience both the god and mortal perspective, as he puts it, asleep and awake. Now this is where we can begin to theorize a little more on the nature of apotheosis, and the same would apply to other characters such as Talos. Ask yourself this: when is Vivec the Mortal no longer Vivec the God, and vice versa? When Vivec's waking corporeal form ceases to exist, does the asleep god form of Vivec live on? Is the removal of the tangible physical Vivec from Nirn a death of the god? Or is it rather just the ultimate separation of Vivec the Mortal and Vivec the God? And if they truly are or become separate beings, how does this affect the moral culpability? That is to say, if Vivec the Mortal did the crimes to create the god, is the god responsible for the crimes? Maybe they are. As you may say, well, there is the living god intermediary, but what if that's removed, like it is in the future? Is the Vivec god culpable? There is another out-of-canon source that involves Michael Kirkbride that many such as myself find fascinating, called the Trial of Vivec. Essentially, it is Vivec being put on trial for the murder of Nerevar after the deaths of Almalexia and Sotha Sil, and after Dagoth is defeated by the Nerevarine. I just want to share this one quote that discusses what we were just talking about. Vivec uses his water face, a condition that makes him cannot lie, and says, "As Vec and Vec, I hereby answer my right and my left with black hands. Vec the Mortal did murder the Hortator, Vec the God did not, and remains as written. And yet these two are the same being, and yet are not, save for one red moment. Know that with the water face do I answer, and so cannot be made to lie." The exception of one red moment seems to imply a clear separation of mortal Vivec and god Vivec ever since his apotheosis, which is interesting. So you can ponder on that while we get back to the canon stuff. This conversation all harkens back to what we were discussing at the start of the video with Vivec's supposed divine birth. For purposes of designation, I will now refer to the physical waking form of Vivec as Vivec, and for the god form I will use his other name, Vec. So to figure this all out and explore the possibilities of it all being true, we may not even have to use dragon breaks. In the original timeline, we could see that the tribunal did in fact murder Nerevar and became gods, and perhaps Vivec himself was just a normal orphan boy, albeit a hermaphrodite. But upon ascension to godhood, the essence that is Vivec changes. There is a mortal Vivec and a godly Vec, the awake and the asleep. But the tangible Vivec we experience, and as he notes himself, is an in-between. He is a living god, something that connects the two. But what I'd suggest is that the Vec god, which exists outside of time, as stated by Vivec himself and insinuated by Azura, then he potentially has the ability to affect the past, along with Almalexia and Sotha Sil, who also achieved apotheosis along with Vivec. So perhaps it is true that Almalexia and Sotha Sil, the god forms, the asleep forms, retroactively orchestrated the birth of Vivec as a prophetic living god, hence changing the past. No longer was Vivec born an orphan, but instead born a prophesied perfection to Grace Resdane. But because the living god Vivec is waking, and is also fundamentally connected to Vec the God asleep, he would have knowledge of this change, and so the Vivec you meet tangibly both did and did not murder Nerevar. In a timeline that no longer exists, the old world, he did murder him to become the god, but the god changed things and created a he who never murdered Nerevar. See what I mean? It's similar to the Tiber Septim Talos situation. Take some time to wrap your head around that, but it does explain why there is yet again another duality within Vivec and how both versions of events can be true at once. Then again, it's perfectly acceptable to dismiss this. You could just believe that the tribunal murdered Nerevar and that the 36 lessons are just made up stories that conceal a secret dark truth. Personally, out of all of the Red Mountain stories, I believe the Nerevar murder story is the most convincing. But in regards to the mortal-god dynamic, there still remains another question. Vec the God exists in a timeless god place. If the physical waking Vivec, Almalexia and Sotha Sil die, that does not necessarily mean that their god forms that exist in this god place also die. I mean, why would they? I think if you're at this point in the video, a really helpful piece we made called The Complete Guide to the Gods, which is linked below, may give you a good primer on the nature of worship and the role it plays in the Elder Scrolls metaphysics. But what I'm about to suggest is that Vec, Iam, and Set, the god forms of the tribunal, still live on in that god place in some form. They have transcended and are no longer bound by intermediary living god bodies. They are no longer, quote, at once awake and asleep, instead only asleep. But this changes them fundamentally. Without an intermediary living god form to connect them, they no longer have that mortal connection. In the same way, they may no longer have the mortal concerns and understanding that they once possessed, perhaps leading them to be more aloof. And in other ways, they are more benevolent, because they are truly disconnected from their mortal pasts that committed the betrayal and got them there in the first place. It's interesting to think about, and its implications would be that the tribunal still exist in some capacity. They even still receive some worship, albeit as the false tribunal demoted to saints. Who knows, if a cult started praying to Vec, perhaps if big enough, he would be able to answer their prayers with blessings. For similar reasons, it's why the Thalmor want to eliminate Talos worship, to weaken the very god himself. Now, when I said that Vivec personifies the nature of the Elder Scrolls best, a universe incredibly paradoxical, complex, and contradictory, you know what I mean. I would absolutely recommend that you have a read through the 36 lessons of Vivec, because they are some of the most interesting in-game texts I've ever read. They are very poetic and stir the imagination, and even today people still debate about the various interpretations of them, much like real-world religious scriptures. If you're curious, some of my favorites are sermons 1, 6, 9, 11, 17, and 28, but they are all pretty cool. And you'll like them if you enjoy mythical texts, though they aren't everyone's cup of tea. Now, there is a final sermon, an extra one, a sermon 37, which is really quite interesting, because it seems that it was written with the future knowledge of events, which would only be possible with a god form in the asleep, timeless god place, that would allow him to see future events and write of it in his corporeal living god form. Let's take a look. You have discovered the 37th sermon of Vivec, which is a bending of the light, long past the chronicles of the Hortator who wore inconstant faces and ruled however they would until apocalypse. There is a bending of the light, which seems to refer to a bending of time, perhaps alluding to how light travels across space, kinda how you can look at a star light years away that has already exploded, but the light of its old self is taking time to get to Earth. The Chronicles of the Hortator who wore inconstant faces refers to Nerevar and the various failed incarnates, as well as the final Nerevarine who succeeded. Then it says until apocalypse, which could refer to the eruption of Red Mountain and the desolation of Morrowind, or it could also refer to some of the out-of-canon coder Michael Kirkbride stuff to do with the Nemedium and Nirn, but we won't get into that. The takeaway here is that it somewhat confirms what we were just speculating about, the idea of the god Vec experiencing a timeless place where everything happens at once. So Vivec, the living corporeal god, would be able to gain this knowledge and write the 37th sermon. There is a lot to unpack here, as is the case with pretty much all the sermons, but what I want to share here is the development of the character Vivec. In this sermon, Vivec witnesses an alternate life, where he had not become a god. The light bent, and somewhere a history was finally undone. Of it, Vivec remembered the laughing of the Netchmen of his village, where the hunts were good. He marched with his father in the ash, growing strong in the hooks and sail, able to run a junk through silt. At 11 he sung to an Ashkarn. He became sick after Red Mountain, with the Nyx blood and fever, and was infirm 100 years. His mother survived him, and laid his body at the altar of Padome. She gave him her skin to wear into the underworld. He saw an alternate world where he was truly happy and loved, and it gives me the idea that there is Vivec with a somber longing for this humble existence. He also has further revelations. The sign of royalty is not this, a signal Blue Shift female told him. There is no right lesson learned alone. Which essentially is a revelation that Kim is not the be-all and end-all of the journey to transcendence, and instead that there is more to be done. The sermon ends with, "For I have removed my left hand and my right," he will say, she said, "for that is how I shall win against them. Love alone, and you shall know only mistakes of salt." The worldling of the words is Amaranth. Vivec is the she here because he changed gender pronoun to signify a mental change or revelation, a sort of rebirth for the character. And the way I interpret this is that Vivec realizes his mistakes and seeks to right them in a new world, a world of Amaranth. For those unfamiliar with the concept, Amaranth is essentially the idea that a transcendental being, as in someone who has faced the Godhead and persists in existence, such as one who has achieved Kim, becomes the new dreamer, which creates a new dream, which is a new universe. This is a way to escape the universe of the Godhead and the endless Kalpic cycles, and it seems that it is the realization of Lorkhan's test, the reason for the Psijic endeavor. That all may seem a little too space cake for your liking, and it's starting to get a little out there, and the line between canon and conjecture is getting unbearably thin. But it's very hard to discuss Vivec in his totality without at the very least skirting some of the Michael Kirkbride's outside concepts or relying on interpretation. Vivec is my favorite god and character in the Elder Scrolls. The amount of depth and complexity is what truly makes his appeal. The duality of his honorable and darker natures, the atrocities he committed but at the same time did not. I think he is just one of the most beautiful, wondrous characters in the Elder Scrolls that inspires discussion for what is getting close to nearly 2 decades after his first appearance in the series. I implore you to learn so much more about him and make up your own mind. Read the 36 Lessons and the Secret 37th. Talk to him in Morrowind, read Michael Kirkbride's out-of-canon texts, and soak up all you can. You may be surprised, I know I was years ago. At first, I was really opposed to some of the crazy concepts, but as I researched them more and more, I really came to love them. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is the warrior poet Vivec explained to the best of my ability. There is undoubtedly minutiae and small talking points that didn't make it into this already very lengthy video, but my job here was to bring the fundamentals of the character to the forefront and discuss the innermost themes of this god. I really hope you enjoyed this full story of Vivec. Please do give the video a like if so, because it really helps us out, and by us, I mean Michael, Drew and myself. I've seen that some have been confused by the use of the word we on the channel. There are 3 of us. Thanks so much for watching all the way through. My name is Scott from Fudge Muppet. Be sure to comment with all of your takes and Vivec theorizing, and I'll be back to nerd out with you again next time.